The town of Grimsby lies on the edge of the Northern Territory, nearest of all the towns in the prime expanse to the loathed Phi-Deb forest. Harrow Deep Harbor connects Grimsby to the northern Sea of Shrouds, which many have sailed, but no one has yet crossed. For centuries, fishermen have harvested their livelihoods from the depths of the North Sea, battling ice, tempests, and all manner of beast that ascends from the inky darkness to plague the hostile environs. It is not uncommon for sailors to cast off from Harrow Deep and, in spite of the many prayers to many gods, not return to their homes. Those who have been blessed, or unlucky enough to traverse the waters and live to tell their tales, pass on their knowledge to their sons. But the generations do not accumulate this expertise, for while on the open water, the only guarantee is that the winds will ever howl, and the waters will churn relentlessly under the bow. Among the locals, many tall tales return from the sea, some more oft-repeated than others. However, even the lost tales live on in snippets of lore and superstitious advice passed on from one family to the next, spoken in proverbs to children to keep them on the straight and narrow. Rarely do the wardens pass through Grimsby, and the Fagar priesthood has not established a presence in the north around Harrow Deep Harbor, and so these proverbs form the essential beliefs of Grimsby's populace. Never step over a line thicker than your arm, nor one whose end you cannot see. Before every cast-off, speak thrice to your woman, twice to your captain, and once to your god, but never to the sea. Count your oaths even more carefully than you count your nets, lest the sea count you instead. The mariners and their kin who lived by these proverbs tended to fare better than those who heeded them not. This held true at all times of the year, save one. After each winter, there came floating in from the waters around Harrow Deep a fog unlike any other. Thick, dense, and heavy was this fog, and it seemed always to move as though it had a mind of its own. It would spend several days at sea, drifting slowly closer and closer to shore. Long winding wisps and trails of glowing neon light danced in the soupy thickness, a spectacle inviting observation. But the mothers hid their children's eyes from it, for if too many looked for too long, the fog did not remain at sea. Many a time the people remembered the warnings, and they kept their eyes fixed to the ground, watching as the trails of mist caressed the land like a tempting lover, only to recede back to the sea after a few days of being ignored. But there were times when the onlookers did not turn away. Instead, they gazed out into the veil, inviting the mysterious fog to their shore with the power of their perception. Such was the case with Edric Saltmoor and his crew. Saltmoor was the owner and captain of the Lantern Wake, a steam schooner that returned once each day with the hold full of the delicacies of the sea: fish, lobsters, crab, and sometimes even oysters of pearl. It was on one of his return voyages that he grew weary of fearing the lights in the fog. As he stood on the bow of the steamboat, his shipmates later recalled that he suddenly turned, seeming to hear someone speaking to him from the direction of the fog. He uttered a reply of, "Speak, madam, I am listening," then listened for a long moment before directing his sight at the spectacular illuminations off the coast of Harrow Deep. Against the pleading of his crewmen, Edric, instead of averting his eyes, gazed intently at the green, yellow, red, and blue lights that grew out of and faded again into one another, slinking through the thick fog the way a serpent slides through the undergrowth of its hunting ground. As he watched, some of the less wary sailors joined him at the rail. All appreciated the subtly haunting beauty of the light. The more superstitious men fled down to the hold, rather choosing to exist among the lesser harvest creatures that filled the cargo space than breathed the free air. By the time the Lantern Wake had docked and begun to unload, the lights in the fog just offshore had increased their brightness, as if warning the fools who watched them that they were being watched in return. Edric's crew was divided, and many a man fled to his house that night, abandoning the sea and their catch, and even their pay, rather than face the dread of the fog. But as Edric's remaining crew worked, the eyes dazzled by the shifting, luminous wisps, the fog crept ever closer, inch by inch across the water. By early morning, the dancing lights hovered over the docks, searching out the shoremen who tirelessly worked there, barreling the fish, crab, and lobster brought in by the steamboats. The lights no longer appeared as wisps, but now as beacons or lanterns that shone in all directions, hovering high above in the fog. By midday, the sun was hidden under the veil, with all of Harrow Deep submerged beneath the thick fog. A heavy smell of fish and deep-water muck, a distant but malodorous stench, settled into the tight and enclosed spaces, though the open air offered some relief from the smell. Shortly this also diminished, and the pungent odor from the bowels of some great beast clung fiercely to all that was touched by the fog. Strangely as it came by degrees, many of the townsfolk, especially those who had looked into the dancing lights, did not notice the severity of the smell, though more and more the town was divided between those who gazed into the lights and those who preferred the darkness of the fog's embrace. Harsh words flew about as friends and family separated, believing that after the fog was gone, all would be as it had been. By the end of the first day, the lantern lights had extended outward, spreading from one end of Grimsby to the other. Survivors said that the lights seemed to seek out all those men from the lantern wake who had stood with Edric Saltmoor on the deck of the steamboat, as though they had invited the light into their lives. This light illuminated the men's paths through the fog, which had now grown so thick and dense that the inhabitants of Grimsby found it difficult to navigate their own streets. An obscure discomfort grew and gnawed at their hearts, as if born from the memory of being brought face to face with some malign and merciless cosmic intruder from the depths of the beyond. Children could no longer stand it, and screamed continually if disturbed by anyone. Women wept for reasons not understood even by themselves. Men descended into fits of violence and aggression, no better than beasts in their worst moments. The sailors whose lanterns followed them soon became guides for these desperate and frightened. But their aid could not last, for soon the sailors began to hear voices whispering in their ears. The boatswain, Aldred Brambletide, reported to his captain hearing the giggling laughter of his young daughter, who had perished of tuberculosis several years back. Wulfric Netley, the cook, thought he heard the stern tenor of his deceased father. Lookout Thane Crowhurst, the whispers of his mistress, lost to the sea. Before long, First Mate Oswin Blackmore, known to be a man of simple yet zealous faith, declared he had replied to the voice of a holy angel, for that was what the lanterns really were, he said. Angels, come from beyond to bring the faithful into a new land. He vanished from the public eye right after making this revelation, and his fellow crewmates did the same. For Captain Edric Saltmoor, he never reported hearing a voice, and no lantern followed him about. Instead, he was discovered hiding in his house, refusing to speak to his wife or his elder son, who had fetched the town doctor and local patron saint to minister to his body and soul together. But neither could make heads or tails of Edric's strange and tattered tellings, only that he whispered in dread of a watcher, a great eye that peered out at him from the midst of the fog, and that grew larger and larger. It would encompass all of Harrow Deep Harbor, then all of Grimsby, then all of the prime expanse, and indeed all of Zarathis by the end, until nothing would be left of the world but that which had been subsumed into the Watcher's nethermost innards, one with the cosmic soup out of which all had formed, and even now out of which the fog leaked like the bile of some great stomach, as if the bowels of a universal worm had inverted themselves and surrounded the townspeople to prepare them for consumption. It had already begun to feed, said Saltmoor, on their minds and souls. Their bodies were soon to follow. It was at the end of the third day when the sailors ceased to guide their fellow citizens through the mire-like fog, for now they too huddled in their homes, under beds, in closets or outhouses, refusing to emerge, threatening with mad and intimate violence any who dared rouse them from their terrified meditations. All throughout the night, the families of the sailors listened to the increase of their ravings till their screams echoed throughout the town. By morning, the screams had ceased, and the lanterns had abandoned their original hosts and now floated slowly toward the center of town. All who had formerly gazed upon the lanterns or been led by their light followed, entranced. Those who had refused any fellowship with the lights from the beginning and had been victims of their loved ones' aggression watched in horror, for they now saw the lanterns for what they truly were. Not lights made by hands, but bioluminescent bulbs at the end of long, fleshy stalks, which hung the lights out as lures, the other ends vanishing into the inky dark. They pleaded with their fellow townsfolk, but the entranced would not deviate. A few were restrained by their families, and they reacted with utter brutality, for none would be allowed to come between the chosen and the path of light that led to eternal life, or so their families understood when listening to the mad ravings of their fathers, mothers, and children who had been caught up in the luminous hypnosis. As the fourth night fell over Grimsby, those who were not restrained followed the lights to the docks of Harrow Deep Harbor, where the fog and stench were thickest. The further they walked, the more their eyes remained fixed on the false lanterns, and the more enraptured they became. By the time they walked into the deepest darkness of the fog, so captivated and enamored in joy were they, that the thing which fed on them did so at their perfect pleasure. Many entered its jaws, eagerly crying aloud in ecstasy, so inverted were their souls by the lures of the watcher in the fog. Those who had not fallen in with the lures were overcome by the incredible stench of the death of ages billowing out from the many mouths of the thing. As they passed out and slept, their nightmares were filled with the presence of a giant lidless eye hanging over the world in place of the moon, peering down upon them at every moment. On the morning of the fifth day, the remaining townsfolk woke to a clear sky, free air, and the absence of the oppressive watching thing. Some rose with minds broken during the night of terrors, for the watcher had so defiled them in the realm of sleep that they would never fully return to waking life. But the worst fate of all lay with the sailors from the Lantern Wake, who had locked themselves away out of dread. As their abodes were searched, each one had murdered any of his kin who had remained in his house, and then each in turn had been struck by the Watcher, repaid their due for acting as its prophets. Wulfric Netley the cook had gorged himself on all that was living and edible in his dwelling, including his horse, his 2 dogs, and his 5 children, so that his throat was stopped by his consumption and he choked to death on his meal. Thane Crowhurst the lookout had seen too much. His eyes were torn out by his own hand, and so ravenous was his terror that he kept on tearing until there was nothing left to reach for. The faithful first mate, Oswin Blackmore, was found upon his family's altar to the god of the sea, surrounded by the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters whom he had offered in sacrifice. Not to shirk his own demise, he had fastened wooden stakes to the altar and impaled himself upon them. Perhaps the strangest end came from the home of Edric Saltmoor, the captain who had brought this entire cataclysm upon Grimsby. In his home, he was discovered sitting upon his own bed. His wife sat beside him, and his son was sprawled over the rocking chair, all 3 facing the center of the room. Inspectors were baffled to find the structure still standing, for only the interior of the bedroom was charred beyond all reckoning, as if the light from the blasts of 1,200 cannons had illuminated the space for but a single moment in time, turning all to blackened ash, steaming bones, and smoking husks. Slowly, the memory of the tragedy faded, encased throughout the region of Grimsby in a new proverb that has joined the others passed down from one generation of sailors, dock workers, and harbor masters to the next. Never answer a voice upon the water, unless the lips that speak it are within sight. For while the path of light leads a soul to a paradise, a false lantern leads only to a garden of illusion, where every fruit is hollow, and every tree feeds on the dead. Thanks for listening to one of my horror fantasy folktales, dark little legends from the world of my next novel, The Decay. These stories come from the land of Zarathis, a place of old magic, buried terrors, broken truths, and places where reality has worn thin enough for nightmares to press their fingers through. Some tales are warnings, some are fragments of history, and some are lies that have survived long enough to grow teeth of their own. As The Decay draws closer, these folk tales offer glimpses into the world behind the novel, fears, myths, and the shadows its people have learned not to name. Once again, thanks for listening, and tread carefully. In Zarathis, very few voices can be trusted.